Well, we're at the end of a 9-week sermon series titled The Most Important Story You've Never Been Told. And if you are new here today or you've missed part of the sermon series, you're in luck. I'm going to wrap it up all today. I'm going to touch on some of the main ideas. And if there's something that I say today that piques some interest, you can go back. We've put most of the messages online. Find those through our website, on our YouTube page, on our podcasts. Back in February, that's when this thing started. Back in February, believe that, we asked this question: what happened? And the question is in reference to the fact that in the first century, the church was irresistible. And the church was nearly irresistible despite the fact that it was very dangerous to be a Christian in the first century. The leaders were targeted and arrested and beaten and oftentimes murdered. Yet the church, wherever it went, seemed to just grow and grow and grow. But here in the 21st century, where it's relatively safe to be a Christian, especially in America, the church is becoming increasingly resistible across all demographics, all age groups, but especially among younger people. There's an increasing number of people that rather have no religious affiliation than be part of the church. And there's a lot of discussion about this. There's a lot of people that are looking at some of the factors that have contributed to this. People talk about the fact that we are in a communications revolution on par with the invention of the printing press. Some would say that this, with the internet, is even bigger than the printing press. People would talk about cultural changes. I mean, just a few generations ago, if you didn't come to church, your boss would ask you about it because it was expected to be a good person that you were at church. There's soccer on Sunday and all sorts of other things to do. There's a lot of explanations to why the church has become so irresistible. But we've been looking at an underlying reason, and the answer to what happened that I've been talking about, that we've been sharing and talking about, is this: that the old covenant was mixed into the new covenant. That at the foundational level, the thing that happened is that the old covenant began to get mixed with the new covenant. And if this idea doesn't grip you, if you're like not, oh yeah, that makes perfect sense, this is because this is a story, the story of the new covenant, that many of us were never told. And it's a very important story in terms of understanding both the gospel and what has happened with the church. So let me break down the Old Covenant and New Covenant for you here real quick. The Old Covenant was given through Moses, the prophet Moses, somewhere around the year 1250 BC. We don't know the exact date, but that's an estimate. It was given through Moses. You can read about it in Exodus chapter 20. The New Covenant, it comes through Jesus, who at the Last Supper, he takes a cup and he says, "This is the cup of the new covenant." The Old Covenant was exclusive. It was for the people of ancient Israel. And if you're not a member of the nation of ancient Israel, the Old Covenant wasn't for you. The New Covenant, on the other hand, is for you. It's inclusive. It's for everyone, every race, every generation. The Old Covenant, in terms of enemies, you were to kill your enemies. Here's a little sample from the Old Covenant. Go back, please. You will pursue enemies and they will fall by the sword before you. That's Leviticus chapter 26. This is in reference to the people being obedient to God's covenant, and God would bless them by helping them kill their enemies. But in the new covenant, Jesus teaches, love your enemies. In the old covenant, you earned your salvation through obedience to God's commandments. In the new covenant, you receive your salvation by trusting in God's character. In the Old Covenant, there's 613 commands. You've heard of the 10 commandments before, right? But there's 613 total. But in the New Covenant, there's one command. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus reduces it down. He says, "Do unto others as you would have them do to you." Later, when specifically asked for a command, he quotes the Shema from Deuteronomy. He says, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, body, and soul." But he doesn't stop there because there's a second part to it. It's from Leviticus 19. It is, "Love your neighbors as yourself." Later in the Gospel of John, Jesus makes it even more simple and more clear. He says, "I have a new command for you," the one command. It's to love one another as I have loved you. In the new command, or new covenant, our one command, the one thing that is supposed to drive us and inform us, is just we are to love like Jesus. If I was to summarize the old covenant with one word, it'd be law. If I was to summarize the new covenant with one word, it'd be grace. And these two ways of being in the world are absolutely different than each other. And if you've never heard the old covenant, you've still lived it. Because most of us grow up, I would say all of us start off living in an old covenant way of being. It's because our world is so saturated with this earn your way in. I mean, in school, when you grew up, if you didn't get the grades, you didn't pass the class. In sports, if you didn't get the time, you didn't make the team. At work, if you don't meet the goals, you don't get the promotion. So much of life is earn your way in, and that's the way the world is. And we all start off that way, and many of us believe that God is that way. But we're under the new covenant as followers of Jesus. There's something better, there's something additional, and it is the way of God's grace. It is a fundamentally different way of being in the world, and when played out to its extremes, it leads to very different places. I'm going to give you an example. So we're going to go to 2 Chronicles 24. Who here this past week read from 2 Chronicles? Yeah, okay, good. That was a joke. All right. Like nobody reads from 2 Chronicles. But it's filled with these stories. And so let me give you a little background. By this point in time, the nation of Israel had really fallen into disarray. There had been a civil war, and there was two different kingdoms by this point, one in the north and one in the south. And the story that we're going to look at takes place in the southern kingdom, which is called Judah. And that's where the temple was. That's where Jerusalem is. But by this point in time, the leaders of Judah had abandoned worship of the true God of Yahweh. They had abandoned the old covenant. And the temple had fallen into disrepair. And so we hear this story about this young king named Joash. And Joash is actually a good king for a little while. And we're told that Joash, that he repairs the temple. So that's good. And worship under the old covenant resumes, and that's good. But then after a while, he abandons the temple to worship other gods. And then this prophet named Zechariah, he shows up on the scene, and here's what he says. He says, why do you disobey the Lord's commands, meaning the old covenant? There's 613 of them. Why are you disobeying the Lord's commands? You will not prosper because you have forsaken the Lord, and he has forsaken you, which under the old covenant, that's how it works. If you follow the commands, God will prosper you. If you don't, then God will forsake you. Now, Joash and his buddies, they don't like this message from the prophet Zechariah, and so they plot against him. And by order of the king, they stone Zechariah to death in the courtyard of the temple. Imagine that for a moment. That is death by blunt force trauma. A bunch of people throwing stones. It's a brutal way to murder somebody. And the writer of Chronicles, he claims to have caught Zechariah's last words. And here's what Zechariah says as stones are coming his way. He says this, may the Lord see this and call you to an account or make you pay. In other words, he calls revenge down on Joash and the rest of those leaders who are stoning him. May the Lord see this and take revenge on you. And if you keep reading in Chronicles, guess what happens? Foreign army comes in, begins to wreak havoc on Joash and his people, and actually Joash gets murdered by his own people. And God's revenge is found on Joash. Zechariah's call for revenge happens. And under the old covenant, this is totally appropriate. Because in the old covenant, it was eye for eye, tooth for tooth, life for life. Now, we're going to go to the book of Acts. So this is somewhere around the year 36 AD. And the book of Acts tells the story of the early church. And one of the stories of the early church is about a man named Stephen. He's the first deacon in the church. He's this righteous man. He's thought of well. And he finds himself in front of the Sanhedrin. Who's the Sanhedrin? The Sanhedrin is a group of leaders in Jerusalem that are responsible and have authority over the Jewish religion. It's the same group of people that brought Jesus to trial and that arranged for Jesus' resurrection. These are not nice people. They are not friends of the church. And here Stephen is, a leader of the church, finds himself in front of the Sanhedrin. So he gives this long speech. You can read about it in Acts 7, where he recounts the history of the Israelite people under the old covenant and basically recounts how they failed to keep the covenant over and over again. He traces it back through Moses and Abraham, all this sort of thing. And then he ends by saying this. You stiff-necked people, your hearts and ears are still uncircumcised. You're just like your ancestors. You always resist the Holy Spirit. Was there ever a prophet your ancestors did not persecute? They even killed those who predicted the coming of the righteous one. And he concludes by saying, and that righteous one, which was Jesus, came and you killed him. Now, how do you think the people responded to this? Well, Luke tells us, he says, at this they covered their ears and yelling at the top of their voices, they all rushed at him and dragged him out of the city and began to stone him. Because under the old covenant, there's grounds for stoning people. Now, Luke, who wrote the Gospel of Luke, is thought to have written this book as well, the book of Acts. And somehow Luke found out what Stephen's last words are. Now, what do you think that Stephen says? Do you think he just repeats what the prophet Zechariah says? May the Lord see this and hold them to account. May God take revenge. What do you think that he's going to say, being a person under the new covenant? Here's what he says. Lord, do not hold this sin against them. Blunt force trauma, okay? Stones coming his way. And instead of calling for revenge, what does Stephen do? He prays for forgiveness for his persecutors. Why in the world would anybody do that? Well, it's because Jesus did that. When Jesus was up on the cross, he prays for his persecutors, saying, Lord, forgive them, for they know not what they do. What a difference. What a change. Under the old covenant, you kill and you curse your enemies. When it's taken to its extreme, there's grounds for killing and cursing your enemies. But under the new covenant, you pray and die for your enemies. And this is a dramatic change in the way that we operate. I had a bunch of little kids at my house yesterday. We have all these neighbor kids. And this little girl was picking on her brother. And why was she picking on her brother? Well, because he did it first, right? Anybody familiar with that? Anybody grow up that way? He did it first, and so, I'm going to take revenge on him. And I said, are you a follower of Jesus? Because I know her parents, and she is. And she says, well, yes. I said, well, Jesus teaches that we are not to take revenge. And you could see her little mind just not computing with that idea because you take revenge at this, the playground. I'm like, we don't take revenge. It's different for those that are followers of Jesus under the new covenant. Now, it's thought that Stephen was stoned around the year 36 AD. And if you're to keep reading in the book of Acts, you'll read that a great persecution breaks out against the church. And all the followers of Jesus that are in Jerusalem, they disperse all throughout the Roman Empire. They're on the run, they're in hiding. Then around the year 64 AD, there's an emperor named Nero, and a great fire breaks out in the city of Rome. And Nero blames the Christians for the fire. It's thought that Nero said it himself, but he blames the Christians. And the Christians are brought into his circus, and they are fed to lions and used as torches set on fire. Later, at the end of the century, there's Emperor Domitian. And Domitian, specifically in the modern-day Turkey, there's a persecution of Christians because Domitian claims to be God, a living God, and he wants people to worship them. And the letter of Revelation is written to 7 churches in this area addressing the persecution and the pressure created by Domitian. Don't give up. Don't give in is John's message to this persecution. There's persecution that breaks out in the 2nd century, and then in the 3rd century, it really begins to heat up. And at the beginning of the 4th century, the great persecution under Diocletian begins, and the Christians are purged from the army and purged from the government, and their property is confiscated, and their leaders are targeted, and the church literally goes underground and at times worships in the catacombs. And they're bruised and beaten, and things look bleak for the early church. And then a man named Constantine has a conversion experience. He claims to have seen a vision of the risen Lord, and he tells his soldiers to put a cross on their shields, and he wins a decisive battle, and he ends up becoming emperor of the Roman Empire. And in 313, he issues the Edict of Milan, which legalizes Christianity and begins to give the church some favor. And what a change in circumstances. What a divine blessing from God. And the church by this point in time has been dealing with a bunch of complicated theological battles. And so Constantine bankrolls something called the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. And these bishops who were bruised and beaten and battered are now getting the royal treatment. And they're discussing their theological matters in front of the emperor, who is bankrolling this council. And some of you grew up hearing or reciting the Nicene Creed. This is where it comes from. And it would seem like, wow, the church has persevered through persecution, and look at the blessing. But then, soon after, people like Firmicus begin to show up. And Firmicus, he was a pagan astrologer that converts to Christianity. And Firmicus writes a document to Constantine's sons, who are now in charge of the empire. And there's manuscripts of Firmicus's document that still exists today. And Firmicus, he reminds Constantine's brothers, our sons, that they are servants of God, and therefore they must enforce the persecution of the pagan religions and confiscate their properties. And Firmicus is a fan of something called forced conversions. By the end of the 4th century with Theodosius, Christianity becomes the only legal religion in the Roman Empire, and widespread persecution of pagan religions unfolds. Now, what's the rationale that people like Firmicus use for this sort of change in the way of being? Well, it's from the Old Covenant. In fact, in the manuscript that survives from Firmicus's letter, he quotes from Deuteronomy. He quotes this: "If your very own brother or your son or daughter or the wife you love or your closest friend secretly entices you, saying, 'Let us go and worship other gods,' do not listen to him." Well, that seems pretty reasonable, right? But he goes on. "Show them no pity. Do not spare them or shield them. You must certainly put them to death. Your hand must be the first in putting them to death, and then the hands of all people. Stone them to death." We wonder why Zechariah got stoned or Stephen got stoned. Well, this is in the Old Covenant. Now, I believe that God gave the Old Covenant in that historical period for a purpose, and it served its purpose. I don't understand all of it, but God gave it. It was divinely ordained and good. But I am so glad we're under the new covenant. I don't want to stone anyone I love. In the matter of 100 years, Christians go from persecuted to persecutors. This is part of our history. This is part of the story of the mixing and blending of old covenant ideas and ways of thinking into the new covenant, and why the church has become irresistible at times throughout the centuries. In the 11th century, the Christian Crusades begin. And there's this idea that if you go and take back the Holy Land with this holy war, that somehow that individual good work will save you from purgatory. What's purgatory? Purgatory is a made-up idea by the church that there's some sort of cosmic waiting room that we go to. And depending on how things go in purgatory, you might go to heaven, you might go to hell. And this idea in an illiterate society was compelling. And crusaders were told that if they went and did this good work, this holy war, that would free them from purgatory, free them from the consequence of hell. And people believed it. And this ended up leading to the idea of selling indulgences. Indulgences is this idea that we all sin, and so at first you would do a good work to pay for those sins. But then they began to offer the idea that you could just give money and you could pay for God's blessing and God's forgiveness. That is why when we collect the offering, I make a point to say it's not an obligation, it's an opportunity, because you cannot buy your way into God's grace, because grace is freely given But at this point in time, the church began to push this idea of selling indulgences. It got so bad that some of them would preach sermons about this concept that you could buy your loved one who's deceased, you could buy their way out of purgatory or hell. And the pastors would get up there and be like, can't you hear your great Aunt Betsy screaming and crying and suffering and pain? And why won't you do something about it? And it was manipulative and it was corrupt. This sparked the Protestant Reformation. Internal reforms were attempted within the church at that point in time, but finally a protest movement arose. And out of the Protestant Reformation, there was 5 key ideas, the 5 solas, that were formed from the thoughts and the sermons of the Protestant reformers. And each one of these solas was in direct response to the great abuses of the church of that day. The first one was Sola Scriptura, or Scripture alone, saying that the only authority is the Scripture. If you can't find it in the Bible, then you don't need to follow it. And this was in direct response to the idea that church tradition and the word of the Pope at that time carried authority. Then came the idea of faith alone. And this is in response to the idea of buying indulgences and doing good works to earn your way into God's favor. Next came the idea of grace alone, because the only way that we get God's favor is through receiving God's grace. It's a gift. The Apostle Paul says it's a gift so that none of us can boast. The next one is Christ alone. It's only through Jesus. Jesus is the only authority that we need. It stops at Jesus. It begins at Jesus. It is Christ alone. And finally, for the grace or the glory of God alone. There's only one reason we're doing this. It's really simple. It's for God's glory, so God's name would be known, so God's love and grace and the hope that's found in that would be known. And these 5 solas were in response to the corruption of the church in that day. And I sum it up this way, make it as simple as possible. The gospel is that we are saved by grace to love like Jesus. It's simple. It's not easy, but it's simple. It's not easy to actually believe that you're saved by grace, because you know what? If you're to believe that you're saved by grace, that's an attack on your ego. As one neighbor of mine said, are you trying to tell me my works, my actions don't matter? And I said, well, in terms of your eternal salvation, you can only receive it. That's what I believe the Bible, that's what I believe that Jesus and Paul and John and Peter are telling us. And once we understand that we're saved by grace, it changes our hearts. And what are we to do? Simply love like Jesus. Our whole lives are to be modeled after the model of love that Jesus provides. Simple. I want to finish off with a story from Luke 19. This is the story of Palm Sunday. We talked about it with the kids. Jesus is making his entry into Jerusalem. And the people are all out there. It's like a big, huge parade in New Orleans or somewhere like that, right? It's wild and it's wonderful, and people are excited because they think the king is coming, yet he's riding on a donkey, and that's a little weird, but hey, we're excited anyways. And they pull the palms off the trees, and they're waving them. They put their coats down, and it's this big to-do. And every one of the Gospels tells this story, but there's a detail in Luke that I think is really powerful and helpful for us. He says, as he, Jesus, approached Jerusalem and saw the city, he wept over it. Jesus is riding in and everybody's celebrating, but he is weeping and crying. Why? He tells us. He says, if you, even you, had only known on this day what would bring you peace, but now it is hidden from your eyes. And he goes on to describe how the temple would be destroyed by the Romans. Because what Jesus understood is that there was a group of people who saw no other way to respond to the oppression of the Romans and their violence with anything other than violence. There's a group of people who were revolutionaries, and that they were going to rise up and try to overthrow the Romans. And indeed, they try. And in 70 AD, the Romans come in and they take the city of Jerusalem and they destroy the temple. And religion, as it's described under the Old Covenant, would never exist again, because you can't fulfill all the laws of the old covenant without the temple. And Jesus is weeping over this because he had tried to provide an alternative, tried to save some lives, tried to show them something that would really work. It's not violence, it's not the war horse, it's the peace and willingness to sacrifice, symbolized by the donkey. But they're not getting it. But they're missing it. So quickly, kill your enemies. Be afraid of those that are different from you. Take matters into your own hands. So quickly, that wins over. And there's an irony, and it's sad. But the old covenant way that authorizes the destruction of their enemies ultimately leads to their own destruction. And the Apostle Paul, who lived under the old covenant, who was persecuting the church and seeking out this new ragtag group of knockoff Jewish religion that was called the Way, that was claiming Jesus was the Christ, he understood where this would go. Because Paul was there when Stephen was stoned. We're told that Paul held the coats of the men that stoned Stephen. Paul participated in the murder of somebody that would dare to offer a different perspective, because there was rationalization and authorization under the old covenant to do so. And these revolutionaries that felt like they were authorized to kill their enemies and to rise up against the Romans, it ultimately leads to their destruction. And Jesus, he weeps. What does that have to do with us? Well, I think there's a lesson here for us, because in every generation, we face the temptation to mix the old covenant into the way of the new covenant. And I think Jesus, he looks at us and he sees us sometimes saying, hey, look, they just don't get it, the way to peace. They think that they need to be hard with one another. They think they need to tell each other off and let them know what you think, and you better not do that to me, and I need justice and I need fairness, and what about me? We think that we're going to operate that way. We think that if we let certain people in, that that's somehow going to mess things up, that we need to be afraid of one another, that we need to attack one another. And under the old covenant, yeah, there's rationale for that. You could quote scripture from that. But under the new covenant, in the teachings of Jesus, there is nothing that you can find that would legitimize that approach. Yet in every generation, we fear the foreigner. We fear those that are different from us. We project scapegoats, and the church is divided and diluted. And it's because of the mixing and blending of old covenant ways of thinking into the new, where we rather kill our enemies or at least be separate from them and learn how to love them. So we want to keep it simple. Last week we talked about how church is ultimately simple, and that was decided in 48 AD in Acts chapter 15, when James, the brother of Jesus, stood up and said, let's not make it more difficult than it needs to be. Keep it simple. And here it is. Saved by grace to love like Jesus. Will you repeat that with me? Saved by grace, love like Jesus. Let me pray for you, please. Gracious Lord, our history as a church has some difficult places. It's difficult to hear about the persecution of the early church. It's even more difficult for many of us to hear about the persecuting that the church did to others. And God, it's overwhelming. But somehow your gospel survives. And in every generation, despite some of the things that have happened, there's always been followers of Jesus who are offering hope and grace without any strings attached, because that is how you offered it to us, freely, as a gift. So God, I pray for each person here, that they would know that their salvation, that their approval in your eyes, that whatever they're looking for in terms of that deeper sense of assurance has been given to them as a gift. And yes, it takes humility to receive that gift, but that's the point. You are trying to renovate all of our hearts so that we might love like your son Jesus. In his name we pray. Amen.